Thank you, Minister. Senator Roberts.
Thank you, Madam Deputy President. As a servant to the people of Queensland and Australia, I would like to say that One Nation is supportive of the motion that Australia's relations with the People's Republic of China be referred to the Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade References Committee for inquiry and preparation of a report into the Liberal-Labor Club. I want to commend Senator Rex Patrick. This is his fifth attempt. I thought it was his fourth. His fifth attempt. He must be seeing visions of Groundhog Day. But nonetheless, let's proceed, because I want to set the context. It is imperative that Australia and China maintain a mutually respectful and beneficial bilateral relationship. That requires respect from both parties in any relationship. China is Australia's largest two-way trading partner, export market and import source, representing almost a quarter, 24% of total trade with a value of $183 billion. That alone shows influence. Australia is China's sixth largest trading partner and fifth biggest supplier of imports. 25% of Australia's manufactured imports come from China, and 13% of Australia's exports include thermal coal to China. A free trade agreement was signed between the two countries in June 2015. In more recent times, China has embarked on the One Belt, One Road initiative. This is a Chinese economic and strategic agenda where Eurasia, Africa and Oceania are more closely tied along two routes, one land and one maritime. Those who support the initiative say that it facilitates the development of infrastructure and economic aid to needy economies. On the other hand, it can be said to facilitate Chinese economic and strategic domination of smaller countries on the routes. It's about strategic control and the emphasis on control. For Australia, we see the growing Chinese involvement in projects from Northern Australia to Tasmania, all providing little benefit to Australia, with substantial benefits to China. Other examples of Chinese involvement have been in the funding and support of local academic conferences and seminars, the influence peddlers. One of the ongoing issues of mutual concern relates to regional and global security. The growing tensions between the United States of America and the People's Republic of China in terms of imposition of trade tariffs is placing Australia in a challenging position, given the importance of Australia's relationships with both these countries. Similarly, the views taken of China's growing military influence in the South China Sea remain of concern to the United States of America and necessarily Australia as an established ally of the United States. Regionally, China is having a growing influence by funding infrastructure projects for some of the Pacific Island countries and Papua New Guinea. This runs the risk of changing the dynamic between Australia and our near neighbours. Australia is a destination of choice for many Chinese students to further their education in an Australian academic institution. In 2018, Madam Deputy President, there were more than 166,000 enrolments of Chinese students in Australia, representing 43% of the total international student cohort. A concern noted in some Australian universities is the potential dependence generated by full fee-paying international students on the overall money pool available to the university budgets. The concern is that should those numbers suddenly diminish, it may leave some of the universities destitute. The unfettered Chinese development of 5 research bases now within the Australian Antarctic Territory is of growing concern to many at a time when Australian investment into its 3 bases in that territory has been considered relatively conservative by comparison. Given the potential for military and strategic use of these bases by China and the potential for resource extraction at some future time, there is need to consider this factor when examining our relationships with China. Australia is a favourite destination for Chinese tourists, and this is shown by recent numbers. More than 1.3 million Chinese tourists visited Australia last year, representing 15% of the total number of visitors. This is a clear positive for Australia. At the same time, there is a growing boom of tourists heading for China, which is welcoming tourists from around the world, including 700,000 of them from Australia. So we have a complex and strong relationship, but with potential for being derailed and for hurting our country. Consider some of these recent developments. So I'll move to recent developments, and I look at the Liberal Party's Andrew Hastie, who wants an inquiry into the relationship, who speaks out against China's violations, and who was recently banned from visiting that country just for speaking out. I look at Senator Kimberley Kitching from the Labor Party. From memory, she co-sponsored one of Senator Patrick's motions, and yet we see the New South Wales Labor Party immersed in ICAC revelations. And then we remember Senator Sam Dastyari's bills being paid by Chinese. We have questions over the Liberal Party interactions with Chinese influencers. We have the Gladys Liu affair, sloppy answers, repeated memory failures, honorary chairman of an institution of which she doesn't know the daily operations, contradictions with facts, or at least serious questions. Bo Nick Zhao found dead in a Melbourne motel soon after claiming publicly that Chinese government approached him to stand as a candidate to be their man in this building. Are there others? Is Chinese Gladys Liu their person?
Senator Roberts, I just remind you to refer to those in the other place by their correct titles. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Deputy President. Yet, we also see Senator Patrick's vote on the 12th of September 2019, just days after we first debated this motion, second time we debated this motion, enabled the government to escape scrutiny over the Liu affair, as it's known. We see
Senator Roberts, unless you're quoting, that's really inappropriate. You need to refer to those in the other chamber by their correct titles.
Okay, I thought I was talking about the Liu affair, but I'll say the affair that involved Ms Gladys Liu. We have...
Order.
We'll get to that. Essential infrastructure, like Darwin's port. How was the government not thinking strategically when they allowed China into this important northern gateway for 99 years? And this port is the home of our local naval presence. And Andrew Robb, who gave them the deal, and then ended up on a salary of $880,000 immediately leaving the parliament. And then we consider Mr Peter Dutton's recent comments on the 12th of October, reported on the 12th of October this year. And I quote from a newspaper article, "One of the Morrison government's most senior figures has taken a direct swipe at Beijing, accusing the Chinese Communist Party of behaving in ways that are inconsistent with Australian values." And that is significant when I move into the third part. Key points from Mr Dutton's comments. He said that the federal government would call out state actors if it was in the national interest. He said he wanted universities to be free from foreign influence. This is a senior Liberal government minister. The Home Affairs Minister also criticised China's Belt and Road Initiative and defended a ban on using Huawei to build Australia's 5G network. Minister Peter Dutton warned Australia would call out foreign interference in universities as well as cyber hacks and theft of intellectual property, insisting it was the right thing to do. So he is concerned. A senior minister in an important portfolio is concerned. It represents, as this newspaper said, some of the strongest language yet from a federal government minister just a month and a half ago on the threat posed by China. Quote from Minister Dutton, "Our issue is not with the Chinese people. I wholeheartedly concur. Our issue is not with the Chinese people, not with the amazing Chinese diaspora community we have here in Australia. My issue," he says, "is with the Communist Party of China and their policies to the extent that they're inconsistent with our own values," Mr Dutton said. I endorse that, Madam Deputy President. The Chinese people have a long history in our country and helped us develop the North and indeed the South, and have contributed remarkably and continue to contribute. But do we hear similar incidents, anything like this number, about India? No. Japan? No. Singapore? No. Taiwan? No. Malaysia? No. Thailand? No. Cambodia? No. Laos? No. Now, let's look at the government's gatekeepers on our country. The first one, Foreign Investment Review Board. What do we see? Unhindered growth in Chinese assets in this country. China now owns 10 times the amount of Australian land that it did in September 2018. 12 months, 10 times. 10 times. They acquire the best of our assets, as Senator Patrick pointed out, for less, with little or no benefit back to the Australian people. As Senator Patrick said, they're picking the eyes out of the treasures: agriculture, mineral reserves, businesses, processing, assets in general. They're moving into secondary and manufacturing industry as well as primary. The Foreign Investment Review Board, that's the gatekeeper, faced 11,855 investigations with a staff of 1 full-time executive and 7 part-time people, 4.5 full-time equivalents, with one of them being an executive. Of the 11,855 investigations, 5 were knocked back, 0.04%. How can these people possibly give full and proper consideration to each investigation? Madam Deputy President, they cannot. It needs to be renamed possibly the FISB, the Foreign Investment Skimming Board, or the FITB, the Foreign Investment Tick and Flick Board. Now consider the dairy industry. China has taken our best farms and our best milk products. They now ship milk, our milk and milk products, to China, paying a low cost here and value-adding and taking the profits to China. Bellamy's milk, just a couple of weeks ago, a large producer of infant formula, is now in Chinese hands. Dairy farmers here at Parliament House, just out the front today, told me the Chinese are not competent in the dairy industry and are wrecking the industry. Energy. Think of the primacy of energy. I've discussed that many times. Energy is essential for competitiveness. Energy is essential for productivity. Energy is essential for wealth generation. Energy is essential for all aspects of our life. I've talked about Kilcoy and the investment the Chinese look to be getting there in a massive solar industrial complex, which will end up with toxins in Brisbane's water supply, a removal of productive capacity, removal of productive agricultural land, high energy prices when we subsidise the Chinese investment, unsightly blight on the countryside. You know, I've mentioned it before, when the Japanese government bombed Darwin in 1942, John Curtin didn't send them a letter and a cheque saying you need subsidies to protect your bombing. But that's what we're doing with these Chinese who are investing in our solar and wind generation. Clive Hamilton has repeatedly warned us of the insidious threats from China. Huawei was banned from 5G implementation in this country and other countries. And Huawei has announced just yesterday its new strategic council is Xenophon Davis, with Nick Xenophon being, well, we all know Nick Xenophon was a former senator, and I learned that Mark Davis is a former ABC and SBS journalist. So let's move on to the third aspect. So the warning, we've seen the huge potential, the strong relationship. We've also seen the recent increases in that intricacy. Now let's look at the incompatibility of Australian values and Chinese government values. Chinese people are fine. The Australian values, though, do not mesh with the Chinese government. Consider Australian citizen Yang Hengjun. And I'll read from the Weekend Australian on August 31, an article written by Arthur Moses, who is a contributor, but he's actually president of the Law Council of Australia, the Law Council of Australia. And he said that, and this continues now, that Hengjun has been held in harsh conditions without charge, with limited access to consular assistance. He has not been permitted to talk to his lawyers or see his family. That goes against Australian values. His lawyers do not know the particulars of the allegations against him, just dragged off and incarcerated. As a blogger, he has written thousands of articles promoting the rule of law, democracy and human rights, and built up a large following in China, all entirely appropriate for an Australian, which our country goes back to the Magna Carta and the Constitution and the presumption of innocence, not in China. Yang and detainees like him must be humanely treated in a fair, transparent manner. But, and Arthur Moses says this, it is the rule of law that most strongly drives economic performance. China does not have the rule of law. It has the rule of despots. More recently, just 2 days ago, just yesterday, in fact, an article again, quote, Australia says the treatment endured by one of its citizens in criminal detention in China is unacceptable. That is what our government is saying of an Australian citizen. Chinese-Australian writer Dr. Yang Hengjun has been held in Beijing since January. He has been accused of espionage, charges denied by him and denied by the Australian government. He now faces daily interrogations while being shackled. Imagine that in this country. And has been increasingly isolated, Canberra said. On Monday, the 25th of November, Foreign Minister Marise Payne, a senior member of this government's cabinet, said she was, quote, very concerned about his condition, which was reported in a recent consulate visit. So the government at senior levels knows about this, the Home Affairs Minister, the Foreign Minister. Australia has also repeatedly requested that he receive, quote, basic standards of justice, procedural fairness and humane treatment, unquote, during his detention. And the government is aware of China's standards. The government is aware of China's power. Australia's political class was rocked last week, the article goes on to say, by allegations of Chinese espionage and interference in domestic issues. China has strongly dismissed the claims as imaginary fears. Chinese government behaviour is not compatible with Australian values, yet it has influence over some, many possibly, Chinese in this country, and influence over political parties, companies and who knows what else. Human rights is a huge issue where China and Australia have competing views, different views, incompatible views. Australia is a democracy and a signatory to many international agreements that preserve basic human rights. China, though, is a republic following a communist regime that is very rigid, with little room to question the state and having limited rights for the individual. One only has to turn on the news and watch the demonstrations for freedom happening in Hong Kong to see how that goes down. Many Australians remember the events of Tiananmen Square that brought our Prime Minister at the time to tears. The detention of those whose views differ from the regime is a continuing disgrace and worthy of future further review. Let's come to the next part of this, fourth section. Liberal Labor have sold out Australia's heritage. The government and Labor have sold out Australia's inheritance. No wonder they don't want us to have a review of this catastrophe. And what the Liberal, Labor, Nationals, Green duopoly has not sold out, they have destroyed. We have bankers in charge, code of practice that is solid and truthful. It has integrity. We have a failure to implement the Hayne Royal Commission recommendations with integrity. We have the imposition, according to the government in the near future, of a cash ban bill if it gets through the Senate. That's not reinforcing integrity. We have the Glass-Steagall bill that's being avoided. That would eliminate vertical integration to ensure integrity. The government is not ensuring integrity. It is running away from integrity. We have the theft of property rights in 1996 onwards from both Liberal and Labor, destroying the productive capacity and the heart and soul of our rural sector. That is not integrity, because that was done at the time led at the time by the Prime Minister, John Howard, who went around the Constitution to prevent farmers getting compensation they're rightly entitled to under the Constitution. And we ask for restoration or compensation. Every time I will be doing that until they get it. Water, the productive capacity is being destroyed. We have thousands of farmers out the front yesterday and this morning begging for action to fix that and to restore productive capacity. We have our energy, as I said a little while ago, being destroyed, our productive capacity, going from the lowest prices of electricity in the world to the highest. Meanwhile, we're exporting our key resource, the number one exporter income earner for Australia, to China so they can generate cheap electricity and steal our jobs. Then we have the Defence Department running roughshod over productive farmers by neglecting them, even after their own committee has recommended buying back businesses affected by PFAS contamination. We're doing this within our own country, led by the Liberal Labor governments of the last 20 years. And at the same time, Liberal and Labor governments are refusing to investigate, to inquire into our relationship with China. Madam Deputy President, these actions by China would appear to threaten the relationship of mutual respect between the two countries and are worthy of inquiry. They threaten our honesty, fairness and humanity. Sorry, the actions of China threaten our honesty, fairness and humanity. One Nation supports the call for such an inquiry into a nation exerting powerful influences over our nation, with potentially far more powerful influences in our nation's future. For the people of Australia, we support Senator Patrick's motion.